In recent videos, I've had people saying that they don't believe the economy will break down, that government will step in or banks will step in, they'll lend and print and subsidise, and the economy won't break down. Or else if the economy does break down, we won't see a breakdown in the welfare state, and we won't see a breakdown in the authority of the state, that the authority of the state will be able to survive through repressive measures. Now, what I want to talk about is why I don't see any alternative to a breakdown in the economy at some stage, probably towards the end or in the second half of this decade, leading to a breakdown in the authority of the state. And that's in two videos. In the first one, this video, I'd like to talk about why I just don't see an alternative to some kind of economic breakdown. Now, really, there are two reasons. Firstly, the first reason is that all the money charts in the States regarding the dollar and the Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank, they are all showing an exponential curve that appears to go vertical before another 5 or 6 years have finished. So before about 2026 or 2027, those money curves appear to go vertical. That suggests there's a break point. We can't get past a certain date. The other reason is that there is a limit to the amount of debt that the state can take on every year. Past a certain point, all confidence is lost and the state goes broke. Now, I'd like to talk about those things in turn. The first one, looking at the money charts, again, I stress all of them appear to be going exponential. Now, the first one, if I show you that one is a chart of federal debt, so central government debt in the States. Now, if you see that, that is on a nice exponential curve. It's really rocketing up. So if you see it from 2010 to 2020, if you see that, then if you take that out another 5 years about to there, it's difficult to see that curved line getting past another 5 years up to 2026 or 2027. I can't see that happening. And what you'll also see is, what I want to point out is, over 2020, you see from just that little line there, it went up from about 23.5 trillion to almost 28 trillion. I think it went up about something like $4 trillion in 1 year. So that was the deficit, the annual deficit in the States last year, nearly $4 trillion, a lot of money. Now, the next one, if I show you that one, that is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, going from, I think, about 1914, I think, up until 2020. Again, you see a nice smooth, a nice very jagged exponential curve. And you see again in 2020, that went nearly vertical. But even if you smooth it out, you'll see that is going exponential. And if you don't believe me, I'll show you. I've done another one where I've actually drawn in an exponential curve. That red line, that's the same one. That is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Now, I should say the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, what that means is the number of dollars that the American Central Bank has printed and put out into the economy, one way or the other, lending it to government, lending it to banks who lend it out to businesses. Now, that's the blue line. And the red line is a mathematical exponential curve. And again, if you see down the bottom, that's 2010 going up to 2020. If you take it out another 5 years about to there, then it's very difficult to see that exponential line getting past about 2026, 2027. That line is going vertical. Now, the next one I want to look at is what's called M1 money supply. Now, M1 money supply, that is basically coins and notes that are in circulation. Money you can get your hands on now. Current account, money in your current account where you can go into your bank, or you can get on your phone and make a transfer and transfer the money immediately without any notice. It includes even traveller's checks, or your building society account, or your post office account, anything where you walk in, take out the money now. Any money you can get your hands on now. Well, it doesn't include bank reserves, so money that banks hold in the kitty just as a buffer, but they have very little reserves in the States. Now, I should say the reason I'm focusing on the States here is because the dollar is the reserve currency, so it tends, what happens with the Federal Reserve, what happens with the American economy affects the whole world, because that's the currency that other countries and other governments hold in store for a rainy day. And that tends to be what they measure their own economies by, and what their own economies are linked to. Also because the American economy is huge. So that is the M1 money supply. If I show you that, so that's money, that's coins in circulation and money you can get your hands on right now. What you see there is that is on another smooth exponential curve, just going vertical. You see 2010 there, 2020. So if you take that out another 5 years, say to 2020, or another 6 or 7 years, so 2026, 2027, it's impossible to see that line, even if you smooth it out, to see it getting past 2026, 2027. So the next one, again, another one I want to show you is what's called the M2 money supply. The M2 money supply, that's the same as M1, but that includes savings deposits. One, accounts where you as individuals, smaller time limited accounts, smaller accounts where you have a bit of money in a savings account. You have to give them 30 days to go in and get it. So like your post office account, you've got your post office book. It's not one where you can walk into the post office, take the money out. It's one where you walk into the post office and you say, I want to take the money out in 30 days. Okay, that's basically what, so M2 is M1 plus that. Now this is the M2 money supply. Again, you see it going from 1960 up to 2020, a nice smooth exponential curve. 2010 there, you see 2010 there, going to 2020, take that out another 5 years or another 6 or 7 years to 26, 27. I don't see how that exponential curve gets past that line. And that actually matters because M2 is that's the measure that countries tend to use when they're trying to target inflation. So when they want to say, well, where's inflation going to be? They'll say, well, what is the M2 money supply? That is the closest indicator, or the indicator that state authorities use when they're trying to target inflation. The next one is M3 money supply. That's the same as M2, but that includes large, big institutional time limited accounts. So what's called large time deposits and institutional money market funds and short-term repurchase agreements where you're repurchasing an asset. It's basically accounts that financial institutions have where there is a time limit on it. They can't just take the money out now. An M3 money supply, that's what governments use in order to make historic comparisons. So where's the money supply today? Where was it 5 years ago? Now, if I show you again, I show you M3 money supply. Again, what you see, that's going back from 1970 or about 1960s, 1980, 90, 2010, 2020. You see that again? That is going exponential. Take it out to 26, 27. It's impossible. I don't see that curve, if it continues, that nice, smooth exponential curve, getting past 2026, 2027. And all of those curves, my point is, all of those curves, they paint a picture. The picture they show is of money supply, finances, printing money, stuffing it into the American economy. That doesn't get past a certain date. Now that's the thing with exponential curves. An arithmetic curve is one where you add a certain amount every year and you get a nice straight line. An exponential curve is not one where you add, it's one where you multiply by a certain amount. It could be a third, it could be 1.5, it could be multiplying by 10. But it will always give you that same shaped exponential curve that at some point goes near vertical. Actually, it never quite goes vertical, but it ends up at a point where it can't get past a certain date. So if you imagine you've got time along the bottom and you've got numbers up the side, an exponential curve, it will, at some stage, it will get to a point where it can't get past a certain year. And that, in these circumstances, that is the same as saying it breaks down past a certain level. It doesn't matter how much governments print, they can't make it into the next year. And there's no way for governments to turn that around either, because if they need to turn that around, you will get a recession. You will get them not able to spend money just at the time when there's more demand for welfare, and they will have to cut welfare, and the population will go nuts about it. We will go nuts. We think that welfare is like oxygen, and we will react like we would if someone tried to stop our oxygen supply. And what would happen is the opposition party would simply say, of course the welfare state can keep going, of course we can continue to afford the welfare state, and the government would get voted out, and they would effectively be abandoning power. So they can't go back, and there is a certain point past which they can't print their way out of it. And that's the same as saying nothing goes on forever. It's a bit like in a science lab, you have a lump of cheese on a petri dish growing mold. That scientist will tell you at the beginning that mold is doubling every 3 hours. And if that continues, then within a month, the whole universe will consist of nothing but mold. All the planets will get squeezed out by mold. It'll just dominate the universe. But that doesn't happen because the mold runs out of cheese, runs out of petri dish, and it just stops growing. Now, the same happens with money printing. What stops the money printing is confidence runs out, and that is likely to happen here. Either people get so much money gets put into the economy that people get tired of it. People get tired of taking a wheelbarrow full of cash down to the supermarket to buy a loaf of bread, or they look at central government and say, "You're broke. I'm not going to work for you on credit anymore." And at that point, the crucial change happens, and I think that is what will happen around 2026, 2027, 5 or 6 years' time. The crucial change is that instead of printing and lending it into the economy, which is what the American Central Bank is doing, they will have to print and spend into the economy. Currently, what the Federal Reserve does is to print up dollars and lend it to big banks, who then lend it to other banks or lend it to big businesses and make a profit. Or the Federal Reserve print up the money and lend it to central government, who then spend it into the economy. They lend it to central government in the form of by buying a bond. So, but at some point that stops, and the historical point at which that stops is when the state's finances get so bad that every year the central government is having to borrow 20% of GDP every year. So the government's annual credit card debt, its credit card bill, becomes more than 20% of its 20% of GDP. Now that's the lesson from the Soviet Union when it fell over in 1991. The annual deficit hit 20% of GDP, and the Soviet Union went broke, went out of business. And also that appears to have been the pattern from the military coups that took place in Latin America in the 80s. It also appears to have been the pattern from the hyperinflations in Central Europe in the middle of the last century. Once a central government's annual deficit, not its total debt, but its annual deficit hits more than 20% of GDP, that seems to be the point at which society breaks down. Now, I think that the Federal Reserve, the American financial authorities, will actually last longer than that, because there's so much confidence in the dollar and in the Federal Reserve, and people want to have confidence. People want to believe that they can have confidence in the Federal Reserve and in the dollar. And if people want to believe something, they generally will believe it. So I would guess that the American government will probably be able to push it out until its annual deficit is about 30% or a third of GDP, which in these circumstances would be about a $7 trillion deficit. Well, in 2020, that the deficit for the American central government deficit was a bit over $3.5 trillion. So, and I think that can more than double over the next 5 or 6 years, particularly when you consider those exponential curves I was showing, the exponential curve in government debt. So I think in another 5 or 6 years' time, that is when the American federal government can't borrow any more money. At that point, it will have to force the Federal Reserve not to print and lend money, but to print and spend, what's called monetizing debt. So the American government will go to the Federal Reserve and say, print up the dollars, just hand them over to us so we can spend them. Or print up the dollars and just give them away. And at that point, you get inflation. When you get inflation, you'll get interest rates going up. And at that point, the massive amounts of debt that have percolated their way throughout the American economy over the last 12 or 13 years, that will become a problem in every sector of the economy. It's called the everything bubble. Housing debt, i.e. mortgages, corporate debt, that is corporate bonds, margin debt, which is money that people borrow in order to buy shares, or government bonds plummeting in value, banking debt, where banks have borrowed and lent so much money with tiny reserves. If those interest rates go up, a lot of banks will instantly become insolvent overnight, and that will then mean that governments have to come in to print up more money in order to backstop the economy, in order to prevent those companies from going broke, in order to prevent those banks from going broke, in order to prevent property values from plummeting. And then you get into a really vicious cycle where the inflation can quickly turn into hyperinflation. It is very hard to stop inflation once it kicks off. And I think it will kick off at that point where the American Federal Reserve goes from printing and lending to printing and spending. And given those curves, I don't see any way to avoid that over the next 5 or 6 years. Now, what I should say is, don't take any of this as financial advice. I'm not giving it as that. I have no authority to do that. And the confidence with which I'm talking suggests you shouldn't take it from me. You shouldn't take it from anyone on YouTube. Not financial advice. I'm talking about this for political reasons. And what I think it will mean is when that happens, you will get a very serious breakdown, more than just a recession, with banks, companies, property owners, government going broke. And that doesn't mean that life ends. People might think it means that life ends. It simply means that life as we know it ends. And I want to talk about that in the next video, why that will mean a breakdown in state authority. Thank you.